Chitali, if I'm saying your name correctly. Welcome from New Jersey. All right, Germany. So we already have some pretty international presence. Hey, Adnan, how's it going?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. Wonderful new.
Doing well. We've already have at least 4 countries represented, looks like, and coming in strong. One question I always am curious about for those of you who are just now joining, and we'll get started in just a moment. I give it a few minutes just so it lets everybody in, just to make sure that everybody gets a chance. We don't leave anybody out. I always love to see where people are coming from, but I also love to see if this is your first time at a Greenlight Guru event, and if it's not your first time, what's been your favorite topic so far, or if you can remember a specific one. I always love to see that as well in the future. Kansas, Ireland, Leeds, awesome. Very cool. Chicago, even India. So we have just all over Denmark. Great. Algeria. Really appreciate everybody, even across time zones, really taking the time. This is great. Singapore. It's on my bucket list. Okay. Looks like it's letting people in. I'll just ask one more time because I still see the numbers going up. So if you want to just let us know, is this your first time at a Greenlight Guru event? Or if it's not, what's been your favorite Greenlight Guru event so far? Love to see that. All right, we are a minute past, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is Manufacturing of Medical Devices, Design Transfer, and Heading into the Unknown. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'll be the moderator for today's session. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive into the session. First, we actively participate. Please use the chat button, as most of you have already seen that. That chat button is for you to talk to other attendees. Remember to play nice, always be respectful. I don't think I have to tell that to this audience, but occasionally I do. So thank you so much in advance. But there's another section, the Q&A section, up there at the very top right. If you see that Q&A section, that's where you can ask questions for me to actually ask Adnan during the Q&A portion of our webinar at the very end. We'll ask those directly. So even if you don't have a question that you have a burning question in your mind, feel free to navigate to that Q&A section, because you have the ability to upvote different questions. So if there's a question that's relevant to you, go ahead and click that button. I'm going to take a pause for just a second. Is there music over the talk? I see Donna's thing there. If anybody else has a problem, let me know. Just want to make sure. I haven't seen that before. So just go ahead and use that Q&A section. If you don't even have a question, go ahead and upvote some of those. We always get the question if we'll be sending out the recording or the presentation slides. So thanks everybody for answering that question. I appreciate it. Apologies for putting anyone on the spot there, but we will send out the full recording and the presentation slides to all the registrants after the live event. So watch your inbox for that follow-up email. I'd like to say a few things about Greenlight Guru. At Greenlight Guru, our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medical device industry, which is likely a shared goal of many of you here today. We host these free webinars to share valuable insights, learn from top industry experts, and to showcase our industry-leading solutions. Our software is designed to help medical device companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. Our software suite includes solutions for product development, quality management, clinical data management, and they're all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. You can join over 1,000 leading medical device companies that trust Greenlight Guru by visiting www.greenlight.guru for your personalized demo today. Now to introduce today's presenter. Adnan Ashfaq is a quality, regulatory, and validation specialist with more than 25 years of experience in the medical device, biotech, and pharmaceutical industries. Adnan founded Simply Medica in 2011 and has since supported medical device companies around the labyrinth of regulations and assisting them in flying through successful audits. He's worked with startup companies and multinationals to develop new products since 1999. Regulations tightening, as many of us are aware, especially in Europe. Simply Medica enables and simplifies the compliance conundrum to ensure manufacturers reach their desired market and stay on the market. So we're excited to have him with us today. Adnan, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, and feel free to share your slides and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me just share screen now.
Sure.
Right, can you confirm seeing my screen?
Yes, I see the full PowerPoint. I don't know if you want to go into presentation mode but I see the whole, yeah, there it is.
Right, okay. For some reason I've got two screens, but then I can't see your screen, so you'll have to shout or stop me or whatever any point if needed. But yeah, so thanks very much for that introduction, Etienne. It's very kind of you. So just to give you an outline, I'm going to kind of chop this presentation, this webinar up into different segments, and I'm going to take you on a journey of manufacturing historically from the Industrial Revolution post World War II, and then I'm going to talk about how we got to ISO 13485, specifically then talking about ISO 1345 clause 7.5, production and service provision, of which validation is one of the key clauses, and of course many others, which I'll also mention. And then regulations in manufacture, specifically substances which are being called out and being banned, and what we need to do about them, and how to validate those substances, those medical devices with these banned substances. And then ISO 13485 clause 7.4, outsourcing virtual manufacture. So I'm going to kind of go through these areas. But before I do, I'll just give you a further introduction on top of what Etienne's just kindly just given that brief introduction. I worked in medical devices since 1999. And before that, I was involved in telecommunications manufacture and also in automotive manufacture, which is where I got lots of the experience. And prior to that, my own graduation and discipline is in manufacturing systems engineering. And some of you, if you're from Scotland specifically, then you might know. In Scotland in the 1990s, we had our own Silicon Glen, which was akin to the Silicon Valley in the US. And back then, we had every electronics manufacturing firm that you could think of was based in the central belt of Scotland. And I did a project for Motorola mobile phones at that time. So my final year thesis or presentation dissertation, which I'll talk about a bit later on, was based on total productive maintenance and OEE, which I'll also talk about a little bit more. And also back then, automotive manufacturing in England was huge. So since that time, lots of things have changed. But I'm going to go on and talk to you about the rise of Japanese manufacturing before ISO 13485, where everything related to manufacturing, the disciplines and the principles was being leveraged off Japanese manufacturing for decades. But when specifically when I was studying manufacturing systems engineering, lots of the principles during my studies was leveraged from Japanese principles, and specifically the lean manufacturing system, Toyota production manufacturing system. There were Shigeo Shingo, which I'll come on to in a second. He talked a lot about waste elimination, just-in-time delivery, continuous improvement. And some of you may have heard of some of these terms of Kanban, Kaizen, Gemba, and so forth. There's lots of these terminologies which came from Japanese manufacturing principles, and they made its way over to the West culturally. So back then, if I kind of take you on that chronological historical journey, there was lots of the principles that were in manufacturing were coming from the US, and the Japanese basically took a lot of them and refined them into their own principles and gave them their own specific names. And a lot of this is to do with culture, which I'm going to come on to that in a second, which is really interesting. But Shigeo Shingo was known for his zero quality control. So this was before Lean Six Sigma. And when I was working at Motorola, some of you might know that Motorola also conceptualized lots of the Six Sigma principles. So who was the actual pioneer? You know, it can be argued and debated. Some people may wish to think otherwise, but I mean, there's a lot that contributes to Japanese manufacturing, and also single minute exchange of dies, was a wonderful technique which I had the benefit of deploying and implementing in many of my roles as a lead production engineer, as a manufacturing engineer, prior to getting into consultancy and quality in medical devices, where the concept of single minute exchange of dies was that why is it taking so long in manufacturing to change one die setup to another setup, where you may change your manufacturing line from X to Y and then Y to Z, whether that's extrusion machines and you have to change the dies, whether it's injection molding machines and you have to change the setup there. It's all about reducing it back down to single minutes rather than 10, 20, 40, 50 minutes, which is contributing towards a lot of time just in setting up equipment. And then poker yoke, mistake proofing, these are all, again, techniques which are used where you can use jigs and fixtures to try and speed things up. There's lots of things which are used in manufacturing now, like boundary samples, visual controls, and a lot of that is contributed towards the manufacturing principles. Now, interestingly, also in media, this is a movie called Gung Ho. I'm not sure if any of you watched this. This is a movie that I think came out in the late 1980s, but I only watched it in the 1990s because it was something that I was really kind of keen upon with studying manufacturing systems engineering. And this is a movie with Michael Keaton, and he's this executive from a firm in the US in automotive manufacturing, and he goes over to Japan, and he realizes how the Japanese are doing things and how different it was, which was really embedded in their culture, the level of discipline which was embedded in their culture, which transpired in their manufacturing, in their office practices everywhere, whether it was starting early in the shift and exercising before you actually went into the manufacturing shop floor. And then all these principles that we've been looking at with Shigeo Shingo, and which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then also this book was also very interesting because we had to read this as part of our syllabus in the manufacturing systems engineering, The Goal, which again is a fiction book, which Eli Goldratt wrote also back in the 1990s, and now is through its third edition. And it was also about a failed manufacturing site, and he was given several months to turn it around, and he describes all the obstacles which he came across during that period. So those are just sort of interesting backreading for the audience. Some of you may have heard of Deming. He was also very well known for statistical process control, the PDCA, or Plan, Do, and Check Act cycle, which was also promoting continuous improvement, such as Kaizen, and then reducing process variation and looking at minimizing variability in the process. And it's all about fine tuning, really kind of looking at the processes and eliminating losses and increasing your yield. So these are some of the targets of these principles. System management focus, problems arising from systems, not workers. And we'll look at some of the other tools that are also commonly used in manufacturing. Juran, another one of the quality gurus, known for his quality trilogy, quality planning, quality control, quality improvement, that top management must lead quality efforts. And then also making sure that products are fit for use, but must meet customer needs effectively. And then the cost of quality and investment in yield, financial benefits. So those are some of the practices, again, that were looked at from Juran. And then Crosby, another one of the great quality gurus, was known for his four absolutes of quality: the 0 defects, prevention over inspection, measurement of quality, and then quality, which is defined to conformance by requirements. So these are, again, looking at some of the principles. And then Ishikawa, another, again, one of the Japanese philosophers, he had the what's known as the fishbone diagram. Some people use that as the cause and effect diagram, or also known as the 4 M's, or 5 M's even. or whether that's been replaced by human, machine, method, materials, and Mother Nature, right? So those would be the principles, and you would use that fishbone diagram to try and get to what is the root cause of the issue that we're trying to solve the problem for. So these are tools that are used and are still and should be used in all manufacturing, especially if you're doing a root cause analysis in something like CAPA. When you're doing a corrective action, preventive action, you should be looking at tools like this. And this is a typical tool that's used. You've got visual quality tools and then statistical methods as well, which I won't go into too much detail. So, as I said earlier on, TPM, or total productive maintenance, and overall equipment effectiveness, which is the subset of TPM, is one of the areas which is very close to my heart, because so I'll kind of pause and I'll spend a few minutes talking about this. This was something, so I did my dissertation, my final year project at university on OEE. When I came to my course tutor, I came with him with what's known in the industry as 5 S's. So the 5 S's are all about discipline. Again, from the Japanese words, Siri, Satan, Shikitsu, Shitsuke. I can never remember the 5th one, but basically they were translated into English as the can-do principles. So clean, arrange, neatness, discipline, and orderliness, right? So that is the foundation for OEE. If you can have a workplace which is clean, arranged well, it's neat, that you have some disciplines around it, and then you have some level of orderliness so that it's not chaos. And the easiest way to explain this, and very often when they were doing training on the 5 S's or the can-do principles, they would show you an example of someone in a kitchen with an absolute chaos trying to make an omelette against someone that was organized with all the tools and the ingredients and the frying pan and the kitchen tools and everything completely organized, and how quickly they would be able to make an omelette. In the same way, you have those principles in the manufacturing shop floor. So OEE is looking at these 3 aspects: the availability of equipment, the performance of the equipment, and the quality of equipment. So these would be 3 percentages which would be worked out as a ratio, and then they would be multiplied, and the multiplication of those 3 elements, availability, performance, and quality, would then give you a figure of the overall equipment effectiveness. So the global benchmark would be 85%, but no one would really get to 85%, because you really need to have very high figures of availability, meaning very little downtime. And the thing is, when anyone that's worked in manufacturing, or here listening, works in manufacturing, you'll know that even when you start up the equipment, you've got losses. You've got yield losses, you've got time losses. There's a moment of time where the equipment ramps up and gets to stability, and then that is the ultimate point where you have the availability of the equipment, and before that you've got loss. So if you've got 8 hours in a shift, you might lose several minutes at the beginning, several minutes at the end, because you've got to do a clean down and a changeover, perhaps from one line to another. It might be from one client to another, which you're manufacturing, or one product to another. You've got to do a complete strip down and clean down. Those are all known as losses. The performance of the equipment would then be, you have perhaps some losses in speed. For example, the equipment might be programmed to run at a specific speed, but again, because of the nature of equipment, it doesn't quite hit the same speed, and the throughput is then dropped as a result of that. The quality is, as it might imply, is the level of quality of rejects and reworks which you're having to go through, which would then be looked to optimize. So when you work out the OEE based on the existing parameters, you then need to try and increase that by these various philosophies. So when we looked at things like the root cause analysis, looking at Ishikawa diagram, looking at Crosby and Denning and Duran's philosophies and Shigeo Shingo's, you would then deploy some of those to increase the overall equipment effectiveness. So those are principles. Now, the legacy and impact of those philosophies is that it was the foundation of Lean and Six Sigma. and it's been up until this very day. It's been deployed, and these are all historical aspects before the quality management systems actually came into effect. So then you've also got automation and robotics. So people think about automation and robotics as a very, very modern phenomena. And it's maybe because I'm a bit of a dinosaur, I'm not sure, but I certainly worked on automation and robotics in the earlier part of my career, which is about 30 years ago. And I'll tell you this in context, specifically here, AI in context. Now, again, because AI is such a hot topic, people talk about AI in medical devices specifically. So the medical device, which is AI, this medical device software, which is AI. But what we're talking here is in manufacturing systems, we've had AI for decades. Since the 80s and 90s, we've had machine vision systems. And my very first project, which I worked on after graduation as a corporate production engineer in the automotive sector, was in fact to implement a machine vision system which was going to inspect appliques or screen printed dashboards for pinholes and defects and blemishes against what would normally be done by a human. And because the human eye can get lazy and there's distractions, the throughput's not fast enough, etc., etc. I mean, the fact is that the single goal for that is to inspect out bad parts and do that at high speed. So one of the things in the industry was golden template matching. So frame grabbing using cameras and sensors against a golden template, matching it and making sure that it met all of the criteria, and any rejects were then thrown out on a conveyor belt, which would then be rejected, most probably never reworked. And then lighting was the main thing that contributed towards the success or the failure of the machine vision systems capability. So if anyone knows about cameras all work on the same principle. If you have an aperture, open and close, and the light all contributes towards good and bad. So the lessons for today's manufacturing is looking at lean systems, waste elimination, driving efficiency, focus on quality, continuous improvements, building reputation, collaboration with supplier partnerships, strengthening the supply chains, and then also making sure that there's got to be some government rules. So there has to be top management which supports quality and lean manufacturing and the principles within. I'm now moving on to the medical device manufacturing itself. So medical device manufacturing, people know that this is a huge industry that we're involved in, which hit about over 700 billion last couple of years, and is set to go over $1 trillion in the next 10 years. Now, we're governed by regulatory requirements, by FDA standards, by Part 820, which is now going to become the QMSR, aligned to ISO 13485. And then we're also in Europe required to follow the EU MDR for CE marking, which is very, very strict requirements. Now, they don't tell you about lean manufacturing and all these principles that we've talked about. Those are all, well, I wouldn't like to say they're nice to haves. They should really be essential in a manufacturing place, but they're not really talked about, and they won't be in any of these regulations, and they're not meant to be. However, when we look at the specific clauses, we'll go into some of that with ISO 13485 in a few seconds. So we always talk about design and production processes. So when we have medical device product lifecycle, we've got everything from design planning, the design inputs, the design outputs, and then verification and validation. But within that, we have to make sure that we don't leave it to the design transfer stage before we start thinking about manufacturing. We must start thinking about manufacturing from an early stage, and we have to look at things from a risk perspective. So also looking at risk management, looking at process risks. When you do your risk management and hazard analysis, you will look at typically 3 areas: usability risks, process risks, and clinical and design risks. When you're looking at the process risks, you need to specifically look at the manufacturing process and looking at what errors can occur as a result of that. So prototyping, clean room manufacturing, again, risks with clean room. Is it how clean is clean? Quality assurance and validation. Now, process validation is obviously a huge area within design transfer. After you've done your design transfer, you should be looking at validating the process and ensure that you've got consistency of manufacture. And again, those principles that we talked about, you could typically deploy that at this stage. So if you're doing an IQ, OQ, PQ, when you're doing your OQ, you might actually, the OQ is often known as operational qualification. I'm going to throw in another OQ, which is optimization qualification, because you need to optimize your process before you get to operational qualification. And that's like, do I know what the parameters are? I've got to do some design of experiments. Again, just to throw in one of the Japanese philosophers, Taguchi, if anyone knows Taguchi, there's Taguchi methods, which again is looking at orthogonal arrays, looking at different permutations. If you've got different elements like time, you've got speed, temperature, humidity, you've got to look at different factors that would then give you a stable manufacturing process. And then also looking at SPC, traceability. And when you get to post-market surveillance, by that point, it's already a bit late to try and get all of these things done. But the reality is, in post-market surveillance, we also need to look at defects, which may come from feedback and complaints. When you do a root cause analysis, it might come back to the manufacturing process. Okay, so then we've also got packaging validation is another very specific area. Designing packaging for success. Is the device single use? Is it reuse? Is it sterile? Is it non-sterile? Your manufacturing process has to allow for the requirements for these, whether it needs to be done in a clean room environment, etc. What level of clean room? What validation standards you need to apply? If you're doing transit testing, your design validation, you've got to do apply these standards. Don't think of that just limited to design verification and validation before design transfer, because once your product, your device is in the manufacturing beyond design transfer, you have to make sure that the processes, even packaging, are fit for purpose. Because you might realize if you missed out on your design verification validation, then you've got to go back and do that again. So just to kind of come towards it, the technological innovation manufacturing is coming from, so robotics and automation is there to boost efficiency, consistency in assembly lines. We've also got the challenges of additive manufacturing, 3D printing, which allows for faster prototyping and customization. And that's an area which is heavily deployed now, especially in orthopedics and orthotics, and those specific areas where there's patient matching that's needed or some customization based on specific patient requirements. And then that's got its own challenges. And then integrating AI with all of the processes. These are all challenges that we need to make sure that we are prepared for. Key challenges and solutions, also the supply chain, looking at cost competition, cybersecurity threats, and then being proactive with strategies. That's really important. The future outlook, as I said, I mean, we've got an industry which is well over 1 trillion in the next 10 years. We need to be able to embrace some of these challenges and the technology that we are faced with, whether that's AI, robotics, and is making sure that we're using them correctly, and the cybersecurity threats that may be persistent there. You know, we've got to make sure that we have embraced it, and we've also got due diligence for all of those aspects. Now, the thing is, clause 7.5 is often understood to be for hardware manufacture only. For those people that are developing some software medical device, any medical device software, clause 7.5 applies to equally. Now, the thing is that, unfortunately, if I was to be a bit critical of ISO 13485, the standard doesn't really incorporate software manufacturing very well. So you have to be able to interpret it and adapt the terms to software manufacturing. So the way I would think of it is for example, in a production environment, if you're manufacturing something which is hardware, it's quite easy to think about hardware because of the controls that you have to put in place and verification of purchased product and all those things that we look at. And we don't really think of software in that way. Now, think of software manufacturing as the environment. Excuse me. Think of software as the environment which is being where the manufacturing is taking place and the development or the development of the software is taking place, and that environment needs to be validated, that you've got adequate controls, and it's got to be also proportionate to risk. So all of the sub-clauses within ISO 13485 clause 7.5 also apply to your software. Now, it's obviously anything to do with contamination control or cleanliness won't apply, but you might be installing your software into hardware, and you've got to consider those controls. If it's in the cloud, then that's slightly different. So you've got to look at those controls in that aspect. So planning and documenting processes, making sure it's part of your quality management system as well. In your QMS specifically, you should be tailoring your QMS towards the device that you're manufacturing. So if it's software only, make sure that your clause 7.5 applies, but it applies specifically for software. Making sure that the processes that you're using, whether if it's an agile process as opposed to a waterfall process, that you talk about that in your quality management system. Soup items, all of those sort of things. You've got to make sure that you ensure that you've got also ID and versioning, control of software. If you're not validating the software or the soup items which are used, software is the software of unknown provenance, not the type of soup that we would eat. So for those people that might be a bit confused of what I'm talking about when I say soup, software of unknown provenance are basically like off-the-shelf software platforms which you may purchase, and you use that to build your own unique software, which is the medical device software itself, needs to be validated. And that also needs to be version controlled. There's risks involved in that. And I'm not going to go into that in detail, but EN 62304, which is the standard for software as a medical device, kind of goes into that in much more detail. But having records, again, how do you release software from production as opposed to having a batch record for manufacturing is a very different thing, but you still must have that record. What does that look like? So process validation for software outputs, the SOUP, the process validation for the software processes that can't be fully verified. You need to have those tests for that. Making sure that you've got consistency across the board, that you've got reliability and repeatability. The same aspects for hardware apply in this context for software. And then installation and servicing software in the field. When you're deploying, that you've got procedures in place. If you're servicing, if you've got patches and bugs which need to be fixed, and you've got comprehensive records which are kept for installation when it's in the field. So making sure that you've got good documentation and record keeping, even in software as a medical device manufacturer, process documentation, compliance records, and making sure that they are traceable for audit. People ask me all the time, why do I need to do this? Why do I need to do that? Because of an audit trail, and it must be there for audit readiness. Right, moving on to non-conformances and CAPAs related to manufacturing. Very often, in my experience, when I do a lot of auditing, I'm also a qualified lead auditor for ISO 13485. Very often, if I'm doing internal auditing or supplier auditing, I find that a lot of the non-conformances which are being raised, which are related to manufacture, are to do with, it comes back down to training of an operator, or somebody wasn't trained. And sometimes it can be a quick get out of jail. We don't really know what the root cause is, and we'll put it down to training. But the question is, how effectiveness is the training? So if it was training, so maybe the training wasn't effective. And the issue might arise if you keep putting training down, there then is an evident systemic issue somewhere else. And it could be that the method was never validated, then you need test method validation. The equipment was never validated, you need to do process validation. QC inspections of materials, components, and finished devices, they're not done correctly. That needs to be considered. And then materials are not quarantined or segregated, where you've got batch mix-up. So those are typical areas where you find errors within manufacturing from audits. And again, that might even be from a notified body, it might be a certification, your surveillance audits, they might find these issues in manufacturing. Clause 4.2.3, medical device file, I/device master record. Now, some people may differ with me on this, and I have argued with people about this, because clause 4.2.3 in ISO 13485 sometimes is recognized to be your technical file or your device, your design history file. And now I would argue slightly different. While it talks about having labeling and instructions for use and some other things, what it specifically says is that you've got to have process documentation, and it calls out labeling and also specifications for product, specifications for manufacturing, packaging, storage, handling, and distribution. Now, for me, that's a typical content of a device master record. The DMR is like, we've done all of the design now, we're going to transfer the design over for manufacturing. Here is the master record for this device, and this is how you're going to manufacture it, which contains all of those contents. Think of it like Colonel Sanders' KFC recipe. That is the golden blueprint. If you want to know how to make good KFC, then that's what you're going to use. And then the DMR basically is that you've got to have your compliance records, making sure you've got procedures for measuring and monitoring as appropriate, even for installation if it's appropriate. And then changes. How do you manage your changes through the change management system? That also needs to be documented. Now, the device history record or the batch records is your evidence of following your DMR and ensuring the records are accurate, traceable, and consistent with appropriate checks. Now, ISO 13485 does not specifically, like clause 4.2.3, where it talks about a medical device file, it doesn't specifically call out a device history record, but it talks about in your production and services provision in clause 7.5, it will require records for production. And then also your medical device file, if you think of it in this way, you might also have your device history record as part of your medical device file. Either way, you've got to ensure those records are there. So some of the things that you need to take away and understand from design transfer is when your changes are made, changes which could impact processes, subcontracting needs, material changes, compliance records, look at the entire technical file, the risk assessment, specifically on the process FMEA, process validation, QC checks. Very often people ask me this question, do I need to resubmit to the regulatory authorities? Well, that depends on the significance of the change, which you may have to, do several things, right? And that depends on the change. And you should have in your quality management system some definition of what constitutes a significant change. I'm kind of moving on to the next section, which is a very hot topic at the moment. We've had the phthalates for a number of years, about a decade, I think. The phthalates have been banned in manufacturing process. The PFAS ban is yet to hit Europe in a big way. It's said to hit in 2026, and that's only next year, that there could be enforcement of PFAS bans. And PFAS bans, looking at some of the statistics, I think there was a survey done in the United States, and they found that 97% of Americans have traces of PFAS in their bloodstream. Now that's pretty alarming. PFAS are in many products, not just medical devices. So there is, with phthalates, there was a huge transition that needed to be done, and their health and safety concerns. The phthalates, I think, originally came from children's toys, where there were some links with deaths and issues with health and safety, the properties. So this is yet to come in a big way for Europe. So we need to be definitely on standby for this. There's big discussions in the European Parliament on this at the moment for the global landscape. So what are PFAS? I'm not going to go into in complete detail, but the medical applications such as catheter, surgical implants, they use it for lubricant properties, and there's also environmental concerns with PFAS as well. There's these emerging restrictions, just like the REACH and the phthalate bans, and state bans, like in California. They were considering action. So there's also been an ongoing challenge with looking for alternatives, and this is the thing that's going to be very difficult. So compliance strategies with phthalates and PFAS, looking at material selection, you might need to look at sourcing alternatives, and you might need to then look at doing trials, also doing process validation on those trials, looking at your supply chain, making sure you have due diligence, then doing testing and risk assessment, and then documentation. Now, many years ago, I went through a whole change for phthalates for a multinational company, where I had to lead this change for 4 global sites across for phthalates for critical care devices. And this is the process that I used for material selection process, doing trials, and then going through biocompatibility, testing, doing transit testing, making sure you've got specifications, shelf life testing, production trials, validation, making sure your labeling is appropriate, drawings, clinical studies, the whole lot. So this is a big deal, to be perfectly honest, something just to be on standby for. I'm going to move on also to virtual manufacturing, just the last section that I will be talking about before I hand back over to Etienne for Q&A. Understanding virtual manufacturing. Now, the reason why this is also so important is because if you're a startup company, most likely when you're starting up, you'll want to outsource your manufacture. So you need to also look at clause 7.4. So when you're trying to understand virtual manufacturing, first of all, you need to understand the definition and your responsibility that you might still be the legal manufacturer, but you're outsourcing your manufacture to a vendor. That needs to be governed by clause 7.4 under supplier evaluation. Evaluate your suppliers, select and approve them. You might need to do an audit on them. So everything that we talked about earlier on with regards to process validation, QC checks, and all the due diligence needs to happen to make sure that your outsourced manufacturer have covered all the areas. Ultimately, it will come back to your contract agreement. So your contract agreement, which is a requirement, quality agreements are a requirement for ISO 13485, can often cause issues if you don't set out in black and white what the responsibilities are between you as a legal manufacturer and your outsourced manufacturer. And I see this time and time again with clients that I work with, where it's not spelled out clearly, and it ends up being this huge argument, and who's pointing fingers at who's responsible and liable for what. So that's an issue. Making sure that from a compliance requirement, document your procedures, document the responsibilities, and verify everything. This is all for ongoing audit trails. This is all needed to mitigate your risk strategies. Your supply failure is a big risk. Making sure that you've not got any disruption, make sure that you've got maybe even a backup. You might have non-compliance regulatory breaches. You should also look at putting that into your quality agreement as well, is that your relationship with your vendor has to be on good terms, that they allow you to do audits as and when necessary, that they share with you the documents that are necessary. If there are issues that they do due diligence and root cause analysis, and they share that information with you, etc. So these are really important things to bear in mind. Some key takeaways and best practices is to integrate your suppliers into your quality management system. Align all your suppliers with your quality management system as per clause 7.4. Make sure that you've got continuous monitoring. You perform regular audits if necessary. I wouldn't do an audit all the time, but making sure that you've got reviews and monitor their performance, do compliance checks, and catch the problems as early as possible. I think a supplier audit should be done if it's a critical supplier. Again, proportionate to risk, which is what ISO 13485 says. You should audit your supplier, and all of the things with outsourcing, contract manufacturing that we talked about earlier. You should bear all of those in mind as part of the audit. Do you need to do an audit every year? Possibly not. If there are issues and there's systemic problems, then first thing is that you possibly need to switch your vendor. But if you're in a situation where you have to stick to the same vendor, then you possibly have to re-audit your vendor and put in some measures in place that will keep things sweet, because we don't want a situation where you're then unable to manufacture anything and everything comes to a complete standstill. So compliance checks, make sure you've got that. Train and document. If your partners need to be trained, and if you've got quality management system procedures which might be more robust and stronger than your vendors, then perhaps you need to put in a clause into your QMS to say, in absence of your vendors' quality management system procedures being robust, then you will allow them to use your procedures. And that again comes back to a contractual arrangement. So in your contract, you should allow for that. So I'm going to wrap up just with overall conclusions, just to give enough time for any Q&A. So I would say ensure that your quality management system reflects your device needs. The last thing that we want to do is create a complete monster of a quality management system which doesn't reflect your actual medical device. So there's nothing worse than having an off-the-shelf quality management system which does not do what it's supposed to do for you. Ensure your processes have been de-risked, so everything in ISO 13485 is risk proportionate. Ensure that your processes are appropriate and validated, and ensure that you've got quality control checkpoints. Ensure your records reflect your manufacturing procedures and processes. So again, you don't want to have manufacturing batch records which don't reflect the requirements from your procedures. So making sure that that is in line with that. So I'm going to kind of wrap up now. Thank you all very much for listening. I will hand it back over to Ken.
Thank you so much, Adnan. That was great. We already have some really good input from the audience, so there. It seems like it was very well received. So let's go ahead and head to the questions. The one most highly I guess, voted was from Michael. He says, in a startup with low manufacturing throughput, how can you determine significant sample size for process validation? Small sample size makes for large error and lower confidence. What are your thoughts there?
Right, okay. So to start with low manufacturing throughput, how can you determine significant sample size for process validation? Small sample size make for large error. Yeah, okay. So that's a really good question. Typically, you can use sampling plans. And I know maybe you've already used sampling plans, and this may not be the answer that you're looking for. Well, things like ISO 2859 and 3951, you've got sampling plans depending on the size of the sample, and it does account for low volumes, and that's really where you have to look at possibility of 100% verification, and validation may not be the solution. Because really, if you look at, again, ISO 13485 clause 7.5.6 for validation, by its default, expects you to verify and not validate. So the verification is if 100% verification can be done, or along those words, then validate the process, right? And you've also got situations where you might have a black art, and it's really difficult to try and control parameters. And again, that's maybe where you need to have 100% verification. So the long and short of it is that validation is not always the solution for everyone. It could be, but it might not be for everyone. So you have to basically look at your specific case by case.
Okay, great answer. Okay, so here's another question that comes in from Ahmad. If I'm saying your name correctly, apologies if not. If an OEM manufactures their class 3 device with one CDMO during clinicals and before certification, they decide to switch to another CDMO after the trials are completed, what are the consequences? Do they have to repeat a mini trial? What are your thoughts there?
So CDMO, I'm assuming that's a clinical organization.
That would be my yeah.
Yeah. So
contract development. Yeah.
Yeah, so Evinomi manufactured the Class 3 devices with one CDMO during clinicals, and before the certification, they decided to switch after trials completed. What are the consequences? Right, so again, I would take that on a case-by-case basis. If you've got a situation where the trials are like for like, if the processes haven't changed, personally, I wouldn't go back and do the clinical trials again. The clinical trials are based on your processes. If you haven't changed the processes, then you wouldn't have to then go back to a different CDMO. I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, I think it would be, it's related to maybe the process validation versus the
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's where I understand that. The process validation, I wouldn't redo the process validation. The only time you do the process validation again is if anything in the process of manufacturing is changed. But what you could have is the clinical output might give you some results which have failed, and you have to go back and redesign something in your process, and then you have to revalidate for sure. That definitely incurs a revalidation for process.
Okay. Great. Let's go to this question from Praful, if I'm saying the name correctly. Once design is completed, how would you transfer that to your supplier? What would they need to get in terms of documents from the design provider? And this kind of goes back to just the design transfer in general and how medical device companies struggle with this concept.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, I mean, your device master record really needs to be robust. So the thing about outsourcing manufacturers is that they will not take responsibility unless they're contractually obliged to be involved in anything to do with the design. They literally will expect you to give them everything ready to manufacture, and if there's anything wrong in the specification, they'll blame it back on you, and it'll come back and say, "Well, you didn't give us the specifications right. It's upon you." And this is why it's really important to, if necessary, audit the vendor to make sure that you're really happy with their processes, and you've got it completely nipped down to the bud, making sure that everything's been dotted and T'd, that you're really happy with the processes. Because literally, once you've got that process and the manufacturer is handed over, they're going to be manufacturing as you've inspected, and it's based on your DMR. So it's going to be your DMR that it's based on. There may be some changes that they make on their side, but then contractually, they should also inform you if there's any change in materials, change in vendors, any changes in their processes, they should inform you. And that might require some further inspection.
Yeah. And I know there was a comment in the chat about QMSR doing away with this device master record, and I know exactly what you're talking about, though, versus being medical device file. That information is still going to be required. So at some point, I don't know if you want to touch on that, on how you would package that information up. The same information needs to be delivered to the manufacturer, though. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, that's again the medical device file. You know, if you interpret the way I interpret the medical device file, clause 4.2.3, that device master record is what the vendor needs. Now,
Yeah.
the other side of it is, if it's interpreted to be the technical file, then the technical file doesn't need to go to the vendor. That's your responsibility to have everything up to date in the technical file, and the only other body that might see your technical file might be the notified bodies or the regulatory authorities that are approving your submission. Other than that, you know, your vendors are in your supply chain. They're your supplier, you're the customer, you know, and that's the arrangement of the discussion of who's kind of has the upper hand needs to be quite clear. You know, that's really important.
That's a really good. I like that delineation and the interpretation. That's good terminology to use for that, because, yeah, essentially, I mean, I guess whatever you interpret it, it's the recipe. The recipe has to be delivered to the manufacturer. Recipe and the bill of materials. Okay.
Yeah.
Tom asked a question kind of related to, I guess, more philosophical, which is interesting. Automotive QMS requires process development in parallel with product development. Will medical device QMS be moving to a similar approach? Any thoughts?
Right. Okay. Not that I know of. But however, that's an interesting point, because one thing I will emphasize is the whole idea of here's the device. We've done all of the design principles, and we've got to the point where we've frozen design. We've done design freeze. we've now got to the point where we're ready to transfer the design, and we didn't do anything about process manufacturing. We didn't even think about the manufacturing process. We didn't think about scaling up, and now we're going to think about scaling up. That's a big mistake. So the parallel approach is interesting to the point where in the quality management system, if it's done as a parallel system of thinking about manufacturing while you're building your device's design, is definitely the sensible approach. But there's nothing in ISO 13485 that stops you from doing it that way. It's only that we think about things as a waterfall approach, which is, you've got your customer requirements, your inputs, outputs, then verify and validate that process. Whereas if you think along the lines of more of an agile process, maybe you can do that in parallel. So there are definitely some, I think, wins in following the automotive manufacturing process. And like I said, my base comes from automotive. So, really, I am at heart quite disciplined with automotive manufacturing.
Yeah, that's good, and I'm glad that we have somebody like you in the industry doing that, because in my industry or my experience as a manufacturing engineer, the medical device industry does struggle in a lot of these areas. So, I want to add, let's see here. I'm trying to find the question I was looking for. Chandan asked the question, hopefully I'm saying your name correctly. What are the process controls while outsourcing off-the-shelf accessories and ancillaries in a renal care industry? And I don't know if we want to be as specific to renal care. I know that's probably what you would like, whoever asked this, but if you kind of zoomed out a little bit more, if you zoom out a little bit more and just be broad enough to answer this for everyone, what are your thoughts about process controls for off-the-shelf accessories? I'm thinking of like ordering something from McMaster-Carr or something along those lines.
So not again. So I mean, for example, you get that in batteries. For example, batteries are manufactured in the millions. You've got a battery supplier, but that component may be a critical component to your device, because without a battery or without something which is a critical component, you cannot function. But it's off the shelf. Now, the due diligence that you would have with someone that's customizing a component for you is not going to be the same as someone that you will buy off the shelf batteries or anything in renal care, which might be off the shelf. That due diligence may not be the same. I would definitely be a lot more sensitive if something was customized for me, but then you should have something like certificates of analysis or certificate of conformance, something from the supplier that gives you that satisfaction that what they're doing is to some level of assurance and confidence. That's what you want. At the end of the day, it's all about having confidence in your supply chain. That's what it's about, really.
Yeah. Okay, Rahul asked, when SCARs are open at supplier end, what are the approaches for manufacturers to go for another design change for cost reduction? Does this change impact to the current regulatory compliance of the product? And I'm not really sure SCARs being opened at the supplier's end exactly how that works. It's not been my experience, but do you have any thoughts on this question?
So could you just repeat that question one more time?
Yeah. When SCARs are open at the supplier's end, what are the approaches for the manufacturer to go for another design change for cost reduction? And maybe we can just, bend it to make sense however you like. When there's a SCAR and it sounds like if there's a supply chain issue, you're just not able to get to a part. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So I kind of understand, because I mean, I've been in these situations before where you have your vendor has a quality management system, and they may raise something within their quality management system, but you don't. And then by the impact of that, there may be a knock-on effect on the design. So maybe that's the way I understand the question. There may be a knock-on effect on what they're doing by example. But again, comes back to the contractual agreement that they must inform you if there's anything that they change in their product, process, supply chain. Remember, components are part of the product. So if they do anything with materials from their side, that's part of your product. Anything to do with the components which they're being supplied, that's part of your product. That can impact your design. So the SCAR that's being raised could impact what you've got to do. And then that would require a change, a design change. So in your quality management system, you've got to evaluate the impact of that change, and you may even need to notify regulatory authorities of the impact of that change, depending on the proportionate risk.
Okay, great. There's kind of like an overarching question that I think maybe would be worth you answering if you want to touch on this, and it seems to be how to take a risk-based approach to some of this. There's still some discussion in the chat about the CDMO, and my interpretation of CDMO is contract design manufacturing organization. Whether you take it from this CDMO to this CDMO, the verification and validation, or something along the lines of, or even that what you just mentioned, changing those components out.
Yeah.
Do you want to mention the risk-based approach on this? Because my interpretation would be, if you're going to take it from one 5-axis end mill in the same building to another 5-axis end mill, you don't have to redo an entire process validation. Maybe there's something from an end mill to a Swiss turning machine. But what are your thoughts?
I think definitely now, if I understand it correctly now, then there definitely should be revalidation based on risk. Now you have to look at process to process, variability to variability. But the thing is that if already it's in a different location, normally, even like you said, if you do move one machine from one side of the plant to the other, you need to consider doing revalidation because the installation has changed. And then if you've got one CDMO to another CDMO, if that's what we're understanding of the contract manufacturer, then you need to consider the possibility of the environment, the process conditions that may be different under the manufacturer, which was originally validated, to what needs to be validated now. So there's a number of conditions. So I would definitely develop a checklist and review that and base it upon risk of what the risk is. And you might need to seriously consider doing validation under that premise.
Okay, great. And sorry to throw that at you. There's a little bit nebulous of a question, so I just wanted to just a conglomeration of thoughts of reading some of the chat.
Yeah.
One more that I want to ask. Let's see here. There was a question from, and it didn't land in the Q&A, but from Chad Chandan on COA versus COC. Do you want to touch on that, or do you have an opinion there? Certificate of what is it? Assurance analysis versus certificate of compliance. Go ahead.
Conformance. Yeah. To be honest, I find that these terms can be interchangeable. Somebody might have a better definition somewhere. I often find that if you've got a certificate of analysis, the thing that's important is that when you raise the purchase order, in your purchase order, you should specify what you expect to see in the COA or the COC, because you might have results. The certificate, if I was to take it verbatim, so if it's certificate of conformance, sometimes the certificate of conformance literally is that we've met the requirements and no further detail. The certificate of analysis, I would expect to give me more detail. That would be where I would differentiate the two. But the terms very often are interchangeable.
Yeah. Okay. I like the comment. Don't trust any of them, Jack. At some point we have to trust something. But I hear what you're saying. Okay. So you've been talking for a long time, Adnan. I'm not going to keep hammering on you. There's lots of questions in the chat, so I apologize to those we weren't able to get to. What we will do is I will send all of those on to Adnan so that he can, if he's able to, as he has time, maybe he can respond to some of those. But feel free to reach out to him, and hopefully that he can get back to you if possible.
Sure.
I wanted to say one thing. I don't think I have my survey set up. If there are any topics related to this or anything else to the audience, I'd love to hear additional topics you'd like to hear us give in the future. We're always trying to be relevant to our audience, so let us know if there's something specific you'd like us to talk about. Adnan, thank you so much for sharing all of your valuable insights throughout today's session. As a reminder, we will be sending out today's recording and presentation slides, so you'll be getting those in the next couple days, so keep an eye out for that. And on behalf of Greenlight Guru, thank you all for attending today's webinar. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.